So having that testing, like you said, because they're not going to do the testing like they do in high school or elementary school. You have to get that from a private evaluator. So I think having all of that really spelled out for families to have that. Don't you recommend that? You said what, within 3 years?
It's not a standard thing across the board. If you have an evaluation within 3 years, I don't know of any college that has a requirement that's more stringent than that. I think the vast majority of colleges would be fine with that. But again, some colleges are super flexible and would say, oh, all you have is an evaluation that's 6 years old. Okay, well, if that's all you got, we'll work with that. So that comes down to the individual college. I think there's advantages to recent evaluations to really understand what are your students' needs now, and to get it in writing from a professional who says, I recommend that in college, this student get the following accommodations. Then you've got, a strong, robust document to bring to the college and say, hey, a professional said, I need these things, so hopefully I can get them. With disclosure, the question is, when are you disclosing and who are you disclosing to? So I get a lot of questions about disclosure during the college application process. Should my kid disclose a disability or a diagnosis when they're applying to college? I've written and spoken on that. It's a kind of a complex topic, but the short answer is it's really up to you as the student. It is entirely optional whether you disclose a disability when you're applying to college. You can apply like any other student and not disclose it. You don't have to, but there are certain cases where it can be helpful to, especially if there's something in your transcript or in your high school career that might be concerning or puzzling to a college, and you have the chance to explain it. Here's why I switched high schools. Here's why my grades went down. Here's why I took a leave of absence. Here's why I didn't take certain classes in high school. For example, I have students who didn't take foreign language classes and they're applying to colleges that say they require foreign languages. So there are a bunch of situations where it can be useful to explain things and to disclose a diagnosis when you're applying. Then once you've gotten in, there's that whole set of opportunities to potentially disclose. Do you disclose after you've gotten in? Well, if you want to get disability accommodations, you have to disclose. You can't get accommodations for a disability you haven't reported. And you can't get disability accommodations retroactively. So if you've taken a test and didn't do well on it, you can't say to a professor, well, I should have gotten accommodations because I have a disability. So you want to get those lined up in advance. Then there's disclosing to peers. If you do struggle with conversations and reciprocal social interactions, do you tell your peers that? Or do you just kind of let them have those challenging interactions?
I would say they don't. Like the majority of even my high school students don't even want their teachers to know, let alone.
Yeah.
Well, I think what happens is as they're getting ready to go to college, we sit down as a family and we talk about, should we start college? They have enough skills. They seem independent. Their social communication skills have improved tremendously. Some may not even meet the outright criteria for SM. They may be more socially anxious. And so in other words, we realize, wait, let's start college, work with the student throughout. I do a lot of consulting. We do a lot of consulting, like as therapy throughout the college experience, starting, joining clubs, how to do it, conversation starters, if they have needs to go up to the professor to get their needs met and so forth and so forth. So we kind of work through it as they're moving through the college experience itself. So we don't always get formal accommodations, but if there's a specific learning issue that needs to be accommodated more than anything, I'd say it's majority of kids with learning challenges that we need to get this more than the social communication, to be honest. Most kids with SM, by the time they get to college, hopefully have a voice in some way. They may not be the chattiest person. They may not be the most elaborative initiative person, but they can speak and usually respond. So it's really around their learning. And then, of course, the possible single room support animal and so forth. Kind of sitting near the professor, sometimes closer. Sometimes accommodations for missed work if their anxiety is really high, trying to be paired and grouped with the same peers. The fact that they do have difficulty speaking up, we talk about that, and maybe handing in a report versus an oral report that they have to give, extra time to take an exam because of their anxiety or a different room. And then, of course, accommodating their specific learning challenge that they may have, like, for example, auditory processing or something.
Yeah. You mentioned that not all students seek accommodations. Just because you have a diagnosis or a disability doesn't mean you have to seek accommodations. If you can thrive and be successful and do well in your classes without an accommodation, that's totally fine. You also sort of alluded to more informal accommodations like sitting close to a professor. If there's something that doesn't require an official accommodation, an official letter saying that you have to have the opportunity to sit next to a professor, you can just sit near the professor. So sometimes the so-called accommodations are sort of self-created. I know, for example, a professional colleague who wears a baseball cap to shield his eyes from the lights that he's sensitive to. That's, he doesn't have to ask for an accommodation. He just puts on the cap. And there's also kind of informal interactions like students talking with peers. You were saying, people often don't disclose. Well, disclosure doesn't mean necessarily telling someone your diagnosis. For example, let's say you're not comfortable with eye contact. You don't have to say, I don't like to make eye contact because I have this diagnosis. You can just say, hey, just so you know, I don't tend to look at people's eyes a lot, so please don't hold it against me. I am paying attention to you, and hopefully it's not a big deal. Or you adapt by like looking at their nose or something. So, but the point is, you can have kind of informal discussions about things without getting into the nitty gritty of what is your diagnosis. And that's true, by the way, for adults in the workplace. You can say, hey, I'm really sensitive to light. Can I have my desk in this part of the floor and not over here, without saying, oh, I'm sensitive because I have this diagnosis.
Yeah. And just to be clear for our listeners, the reason I mentioned sitting closer to the professor was because when they are answering a question, many kids feel more comfortable where they're not speaking up across the back of the room all the way forward. That's sitting kind of where the professor mainly is. It's less that they need to kind of exert their voice, and they feel more comfortable, almost like a one-on-one situation versus talking up in front of a group. So we often make those accommodations sitting kind of near a professor or a teacher in high school or elementary school so that the teacher can kind of go up and reword it to them. But like you said, you can't really make those specific modifications or interventions in college. So the student on his own would have to, or her own would have to make those kind of.
Yeah. And if it's a class of hundreds of students, it's going to be a whole lot trickier, which may sort of come down to what college you choose. If you choose a college of 1,500 students, maybe it's going to be easier to have those conversations and get some of those accommodations.
And there's kids that I work with that love a big school because they feel like they can, quote unquote, not be as noticeable. And then there's others that want the small school because they want to feel like they're seen in a different way and they're appreciated for, maybe their gifts in other ways and so forth. So they wanted that close one-on-one kind of, or a small group interaction. So yeah, you're right. Every single student is different, and knowing what their unique needs are, I think, guides this process. I mean, this has been super helpful. Choosing colleges is not an easy process, and it's very anxiety provoking. And what we try to teach the parents is try to maintain your calm in this, kind of fake it till you make it, because what you're projecting onto your kids of your own worries and fears is only going to make your kids more anxious too.